The alarm did not sound like an alarm. It sounded like the ship itself was screaming, and for 3 full seconds I could not move, because in 200 years of service I had never heard that particular tone before. My name is Vren Ashkatal, Fleet Speaker of the Kael'thu 2nd Conquest Fleet, and I am recording this account from the command deck of a ship that should not still be flying, on a course that should not still exist, with a crew that is smaller every time I check the roster. 412 ships left our home shipyards 11 days ago. I am looking at a tactical display right now that shows 17. I need you to understand how impossible that number is. Our fleet had crushed 6 worlds before this one. 6. We had a formula for conquest so refined that our war college used it as a teaching example, a clean, elegant proof of superiority, repeated across 6 different star systems with 6 different outcomes that were never really in doubt. We did not expect the 7th world to be different. Nothing in 2 centuries of observation suggested it would be different. And that is exactly why what happened to us happened, because we walked into their solar system already certain of the ending, and certainty, I have learned, is the most expensive mistake a fleet can make. Let me take you back to the beginning. Before the alarms, before the silence, before I understood what we had actually done by coming here. We called the planet by its correct designation, but the beings who lived there called it Earth, and they called themselves human, and our intelligence division had compiled 2 centuries of reports on them that all said essentially the same thing: divided, violent among themselves, technologically adequate, but nowhere near our level. Prone to infighting, so severe that entire regions of their world could not agree on basic principles of governance. Our analysts saw this as weakness. I want to be honest with you now, from wherever this recording ends up, that I saw it as weakness too. I read those same reports. I nodded along in the same briefing rooms. I believed, the same as everyone else on this fleet, that a species too busy fighting itself would collapse quickly once a unified, disciplined force arrived at its door. Our approach to their system was flawless by every measure we used to judge these things. We entered at the outer edge of their solar system 11 days ago, powered down our loudest systems, and drifted inward on careful, quiet trajectories designed to delay detection for as long as possible. Their orbital sensors picked us up on day 2, which was actually later than our models predicted. Panic followed, as panic always does. We watched their communication networks light up with chatter, encrypted at first, then increasingly open as fear overtook caution. Their governments, usually so divided, spoke to each other more in those first hours than intelligence reports suggested they had in years. I remember feeling a small flicker of surprise at that unity. I remember dismissing it just as quickly. Fear does strange things to divided peoples, I told myself. It does not make them dangerous. It only makes them louder before they fall silent. Our fleet took formation above their moon on day 3, close enough that their instruments would have shown ships filling their sky like a new constellation, arranged with the kind of precision meant to communicate one clear message. Resistance changes nothing about the outcome, only how much it costs you to reach it. This is standard doctrine. We had used the same formation on 4 previous worlds, and each time the display of overwhelming force accelerated surrender rather than delaying it. Beings with any capacity for reason tend to recognize when a fight cannot be won. Their planetary defenses activated within the hour. I will admit, watching from the command deck, that their weapons were more capable than our reports suggested. Ground-based platforms sent up interceptor fire that actually forced 2 of our escort vessels to reroute, and for a moment, our tactical officer, a steady young officer named Tholrin who had served with me for 6 cycles, allowed himself a rare flicker of concern. I told him what I had told myself. Adequate resistance is not the same as effective resistance. We had absorbed worse from other worlds and still finished the campaign in under 2 weeks. By day 4, their orbital defenses had fallen entirely. I remember the moment clearly because it matched our projections almost exactly to the hour, and there is a particular satisfaction in watching a plan unfold precisely as designed, a feeling that I now recognize, with the clarity that only disaster provides, as the most dangerous kind of comfort a commander can feel. Their capital region opened formal communication with our fleet less than a day later, offering terms, asking questions about occupation procedures, requesting information about what would happen to their people under our administration. Standard capitulation behavior. We had scripts prepared for exactly this kind of exchange. Our diplomatic officer, a calm and careful woman named Issa Corinth, handled the negotiations with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this same work on 3 prior worlds. It was during these negotiations that I noticed the first detail that should have concerned me more than it did. Their surrender was too smooth. Every other species we had subdued fought through the surrender process itself, arguing terms, stalling, attempting to extract small concessions even as their military situation collapsed around them, because that is what desperate, cornered beings do. They negotiate as if negotiation itself might save them, even after the battle is already lost. The humans did none of this. Their representatives agreed to terms with unsettling speed, asked practical questions about the transition, and then, almost as an afterthought, mentioned that many of their people wished to evacuate certain regions before our administration formally arrived, for reasons of, and I remember the exact phrasing used in the translated transcript, cultural and religious observance. Our command staff discussed this request for less than 20 minutes before approving it. I was in that meeting. I voted in favor of approval. It seemed a small thing, a request for dignity from a defeated people, the kind of allowance that costs an occupying force nothing and buys considerable goodwill during the difficult early period of administration. We had granted similar requests on other worlds, allowing populations to gather in designated zones for what they described as ceremonial purposes before the practical work of occupation began. It had always been harmless. It had always simply been theater, a way for a broken people to feel they retained some small control over their own ending. Small ships began leaving their major cities within hours of our approval. Unarmed, according to every scan our fleet performed. Slow-moving, filled, according to their own transmitted manifests, with civilians and what they called essential personnel, moving toward remote coordinates scattered across their planet and, oddly, toward several points in deep space beyond their system's edge. We tracked the largest of these convoys out of simple procedural caution, the way you might watch water flow toward a drain without expecting the drain itself to do anything. I remember Thulrin standing beside me on the command deck, watching the tracking display, and asking a question that I dismissed too quickly at the time. He asked why so many of the ships were smiling. I did not understand the question at first. Our long-range visual scans, adjusted for their species' particular facial structure, had picked up expressions on several of the humans visible through the transparent viewing sections of their evacuation vessels. Thulrin had noticed something in those expressions that did not match the behavior of a defeated, fleeing population. I looked at the same footage he had looked at. I saw faces that I told myself were simply strained by fear, the muscles of unfamiliar creatures reacting to stress in ways our translation algorithms were not fully equipped to interpret correctly. I told Thulrin this. I believed it when I said it. I did not believe it for very long. The first genuinely strange report came on the evening of Day 5, submitted by the captain of a support vessel stationed at the edge of our formation, a heavy logistics ship called the Faerun Vale, responsible for coordinating supply lines and prisoner processing for the early stages of occupation. The captain reported that a routine communication check with a smaller escort vessel under her authority, a patrol craft assigned to monitor the outer debris field near their planet's smaller moon, had gone unanswered. This in itself was not alarming. Communication lapses happen constantly during large fleet operations, caused by equipment strain, atmospheric interference, or simple human error, though of course, we did not call it that at the time, since the error in question was always our own. What was alarming, once a secondary vessel was dispatched to investigate, was what they found. The patrol craft was intact, every system functioning, life support running at full capacity, atmosphere breathable, temperature regulated exactly as it should have been. The ship was, by every mechanical measure, in perfect operating condition. There was no crew aboard it. Not a single member of the 12-person patrol crew could be located anywhere on the vessel. The boarding team searched every compartment, every storage bay, every maintenance crawlspace small enough to conceal a body. Nothing. No signs of forced entry from outside the hull. No signs of struggle within it. No blood. No damage. No discharged weapons. No evidence whatsoever of what might be called a hostile encounter. The crew's personal effects remained exactly where they had left them. A half-finished meal sat cooling on a table in the small mess area, as though whoever had been eating it had simply stood up mid-bite and walked away, or been made to walk away, and never returned. I read the initial report from that boarding team twice before I fully absorbed what it was telling me. 12 trained, disciplined, armed members of my fleet had vanished from a fully sealed vessel, in the vacuum of space, with no evidence of intrusion, no evidence of struggle, and no evidence of where they had gone. I ordered the report classified immediately, restricted to command staff only, out of a concern that I told myself was purely procedural. I did not want unverified information about a single isolated incident spreading through the fleet and causing unnecessary anxiety among crews who still had a great deal of work ahead of them. That was the official reasoning I gave Thulrin and Issa Corinth when I briefed them privately that night in my quarters, the three of us alone with the report displayed between us on a small projection table. The truth, which I will admit now because there is very little left to protect by continuing to hide it, is that I was afraid. Not of an enemy fleet, not of weapons, not of any threat our tactical systems could have quantified and prepared for. I was afraid because I did not understand what had happened, and in 200 years of service, I had never once encountered a situation our doctrine had no answer for. Issa suggested, calmly and reasonably, that the crew might have experienced some kind of catastrophic equipment failure in their environmental systems, something that caused a mass evacuation through an escape pod system that our scans had somehow failed to register as deployed. It was a plausible theory. I wanted very badly to believe it. Thulrin, to his credit, pointed out that all 12 escape pods on the vessel were still docked in their bays, fully charged, fully operational, completely unused. We sat in silence for a long moment after that observation, the three of us looking at a report that offered no answers, only a single confirmed fact that none of us wanted to say aloud. Something had entered that ship. Something had taken 12 trained soldiers without leaving a single trace of how it had done so. And whatever it was, it had happened less than 2 full days after we allowed unarmed evacuation ships to move freely across a planet's surface and out into the surrounding dark of its solar system. I ordered increased security protocols across the fleet that night, additional patrol rotations, mandatory pairing for any crew member performing maintenance duties outside primary living quarters. I told myself these were reasonable precautions, the kind any careful commander would implement in response to an unexplained incident, nothing more. I did not yet understand that reasonable precautions were not going to be enough, because the patrol craft was not an isolated incident. It was the first quiet note in a pattern that would not become fully clear to me until it was far too late to change course, until our fleet was already committed to a conquest that had never actually been offered to us in good faith, though it would take several more days of mounting horror before I finally understood that the surrender itself had been a door we walked through willingly, and that on the other side of it, something ancient and patient had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity, wearing the shape of a defeated, cooperative people, smiling at us through the viewports of ships we should never have let leave the ground. The second disappearance happened on day 6, and this time it was not a small patrol craft at the edge of our formation. It was a full escort vessel, the Ordath Reach, carrying a crew of 83, stationed in a support role near what our intelligence division had identified as one of the human planet's larger population centers, a coastal settlement region their own people called by a name that translated roughly to a gathering of harbors. The Ordath Reach had been assigned to monitor evacuation traffic moving out of that region, the same kind of unarmed civilian convoys we had approved days earlier, the same convoys Thulrin had once described as smiling their way toward the edge of our system. The last confirmed communication from the Ordath Reach came at what would have been mid-cycle by our fleet's standard clock, a routine status update from its commanding officer, a steady and unremarkable transmission reporting normal operations and light evacuation traffic passing through the monitored corridor. Nothing in the tone of that message suggested distress. Nothing in the data attached to it suggested any irregularity in the ship's systems or surroundings. 4 hours later, the Ordath Reach failed to respond to a scheduled check-in. I remember exactly where I was standing when the report reached the command deck, because I remember the particular quality of the silence that followed it, a silence I had felt only once before in my career, and that had been 11 days earlier when the first alarm sounded on this very vessel. 83 crew members, a ship 4 times the size of the patrol craft we had lost days before. Whatever had happened to that smaller vessel, I told myself in the moments before the recovery team departed, could not possibly happen again at this scale. There were simply too many people aboard, too many redundant systems, too much armed capability for anything to remove an entire crew without triggering some kind of alarm, some kind of resistance, some kind of trace. I was wrong in every particular. The recovery team that boarded the Ordath Reach 4 hours after the missed check-in found conditions almost identical to what had been discovered on the patrol craft, except now magnified across a vessel more than 6 times larger. Every system operational. Life support functioning perfectly. Weapon stations fully armed and completely untouched, their safety mechanisms still engaged, exactly as they would have been left by crew members who had never once needed to use them in defense of their own lives. The ship's main galley showed evidence of an ordinary meal service that had been interrupted mid-cycle, trays still set out, drinks still standing in their containers, nothing spilled, nothing disturbed, as though 83 people had simply set down their utensils at the exact same moment and walked away together, calmly, without panic, without protest. I read the recovery team's full report that evening in a private meeting with Thulrin and Issa, the same small group that had reviewed the first incident days earlier, though our conversation this time carried a different weight to it, heavier, quieter, punctuated by long silences none of us seemed eager to fill. Issa, who had offered a calm and rational explanation for the first disappearance, offered no such explanation this time. She simply stared at the report for a long while before finally admitting, in a voice much smaller than the one she typically used during command briefings, that she did not know what we were looking at. Thulrin was the one who first said the word that none of us had wanted to say aloud. He asked, quietly, whether it was possible that this was not equipment failure, or accident, or any kind of natural phenomenon our instruments simply hadn't been calibrated to detect. He asked whether it was possible that this was deliberate, that something, or someone, was removing our crews on purpose, with enough skill and enough patience to do it without leaving behind a single piece of usable evidence. I did not want to agree with him. I want to be honest about that, in this recording, for whatever purpose it eventually serves. Every instinct built by 2 centuries of service told me to resist that conclusion, because accepting it meant accepting that our fleet, the most successful conquest force our people had ever assembled, was facing an adversary we could not see, could not track, and could not meaningfully defend against using any tactic in our doctrine. But the evidence did not leave room for comfortable alternatives. I ordered a full fleet-wide security review that night, pulling logs from every vessel, cross-referencing patrol schedules, communication patterns, proximity to the evacuation convoys we had allowed to move so freely through the system in the days before. It was Yisa who noticed the pattern first, sitting alone in the analysis chamber long after Thulrin and I had left for what passed as rest, and she woke me before the start of the next duty cycle to show me what she had found. Every disappearance, so far, had occurred within a certain distance of one of the human evacuation convoys. Not immediately alongside them, not in any way that would have appeared as a direct confrontation on our sensors, but within a loosely defined radius that suggested proximity mattered, that whatever was responsible for these disappearances needed to be near those slow-moving, unarmed civilian ships in order to act. I remember asking Issa the obvious question. If the evacuation convoys themselves were somehow responsible, why had our scans never detected weapons aboard them, never detected hostile intent, never detected anything beyond ordinary civilian transport signatures moving at ordinary civilian speeds toward ordinary evacuation coordinates? Her answer has stayed with me every day since she gave it. She said that perhaps we were looking for the wrong kind of weapon, that we had spent 2 centuries studying human technology, human military capability, human political division, and had learned to measure danger only in the terms our own doctrine understood: ships and weapons and formations and firepower. Perhaps, she said, this species had something else entirely, something our sensors were never designed to detect because our sensors had never needed to detect it before, not on any of the 6 worlds that came before this one. I did not sleep after that conversation. I spent the remainder of that cycle reviewing recorded visual data from every evacuation convoy our fleet had tracked since the day we approved their departure, searching frame by frame for anything our automated analysis might have missed. Most of the footage showed exactly what our reports had already described: slow, unarmed vessels, civilian faces visible through viewports, some calm, some strained, a few, as Thulrin had first noticed days earlier, wearing expressions that our translation algorithms struggled to categorize with confidence. It was in the footage from the 3rd convoy, the one that had departed the largest of their coastal settlement regions, that I found something our automated systems had flagged as an anomaly but had never escalated for manual review. Buried beneath thousands of routine data points our analysis software considered statistically insignificant. A brief visual capture, no more than 4 seconds long, showing the interior of one evacuation vessel through a momentarily unobstructed viewport as our scanning drone passed close enough to register detail. In that 4 seconds, I saw perhaps 30 human figures visible within the ship's main compartment. They were not huddled together in the postures of frightened refugees. They stood in loose, calm formation, facing a single figure positioned near the front of the group, an older human, gray at the temples in a way I had come to recognize as a marker of advanced age within their species, speaking to the assembled group with the measured, unhurried cadence of someone delivering instructions rather than comfort. I had our translation team analyze the recording for the following 12 hours, working from lip movement alone, since no audio had been captured. What they eventually pieced together, with moderate but not complete confidence, chilled me in a way I had not expected any recovered data to chill me at this stage of the campaign. The speaker was not offering reassurance to a frightened people preparing to abandon their homes. The words the translation team recovered, fragmentary as they were, spoke of readiness, of old duties finally required again, of a debt owed to something the recording referred to only as the Deep Watchers, a phrase our linguistic database had no prior record of and could not confidently place within any known human cultural or religious framework. I brought this recording to a full command staff briefing the following morning, the first time I had shared the full scope of our findings with officers beyond Thulrin and Issa. The reaction in that room was not panic, not yet, because panic requires a clear understanding of what there is to fear, and none of us yet possessed that understanding. What filled the room instead was something quieter and, in its own way, more corrosive: doubt. The particular, creeping doubt that settles over disciplined people when the foundation of everything they were trained to expect begins, for the first time, to show cracks they cannot explain. Our fleet physician, a careful and thorough officer named Drennick Osha, raised a question during that briefing that none of us had thought to ask, and that none of us were prepared to answer. He asked whether the disappearances we had experienced so far represented an escalating pattern, and if so, what rate of escalation we should expect over the coming days. It was a simple, clinical question, the kind any competent physician might ask when assessing the spread of an unknown contagion, and it was precisely because of its clinical simplicity that it landed with such force in that room. We had lost 95 crew members across 2 incidents in 6 days. If the pattern was accelerating rather than remaining static, and every scrap of evidence we had gathered so far suggested it was, then the mathematics of our situation were considerably worse than any of us had allowed ourselves to fully calculate. I ordered a full recall of all forward patrol units that afternoon, pulling every vessel back into a tighter defensive formation around the core of our fleet, a decision that Thulren supported without hesitation and that several of our more traditionally minded officers questioned, arguing that retreating from forward positions this early in a campaign would signal weakness to a defeated population and potentially embolden whatever resistance elements remained. I remember responding to that objection with more force than I intended, telling the room plainly that I did not care what signal our formation sent to a population capable of doing what had already been done to 2 of our vessels. I cared about keeping the remaining crews of this fleet alive long enough to understand what we were actually facing. That recall order likely saved lives in the short term. It did not save us from what was already moving toward the heart of our formation, patient and unhurried, exactly as Yissa had warned, wearing the calm and cooperative face of a defeated people who had never actually been defeated at all, and who had simply been waiting, with a kind of discipline our own doctrine had never been designed to recognize, for us to finish walking ourselves into a trap we had built with our own hands, one polite, reasonable, procedurally sound decision at a time. Day 7 began with a request I did not expect and should have refused outright. A transmission reached our fleet from the surface of the planet, routed through channels their government had used for every prior negotiation, but this message carried a different tone than anything we had received before. It came from a woman who identified herself as Grace Whitfield, described in the accompanying credentials as a senior civilian coordinator working with what remained of their planetary council. Her request was simple on its surface. She asked for a small delegation from our fleet to travel to the surface, to a neutral coordination point away from any major population center, to discuss what she called irregularities in the evacuation process. Irregularities she claimed her own government was concerned about and wished to resolve cooperatively before they damaged the fragile trust between our 2 peoples. I brought this request to Thulren and Issa immediately, expecting both of them to advise against it. Issa surprised me by suggesting we consider it, though not for the reasons I expected. She argued that if this Grace Whitfield genuinely represented elements of the human population who were themselves alarmed by whatever was happening to our missing crews, then meeting with her might be the fastest path to understanding what we were actually facing. An enemy hidden entirely behind human faces was one thing. A human willing to speak against whatever force was responsible, even indirectly, was something else entirely, and potentially something valuable. Thulren remained unconvinced and said so plainly. He pointed out that every incident so far had begun with our fleet extending some form of trust or cooperation toward the human population, and that a request for a face-to-face meeting, delivered at exactly the moment our own internal doubts were reaching their peak, felt less like an opportunity and more like an invitation crafted specifically to exploit that doubt. I made the decision myself, in the end, and I have turned it over in my mind every day since, searching for the moment I should have chosen differently. I agreed to send a delegation, but a small one, heavily armed, equipped with every defensive and monitoring system our fleet could spare, and I made the decision to lead it personally, a choice Thulren argued against for nearly an hour, before finally, reluctantly, accepting that I would not be moved on the matter. I told him, and I believed it at the time, that a fleet commander who sent others into uncertainty while remaining safely behind was not a commander worth following, and that if I was going to ask any part of my crew to walk toward whatever had already taken 95 of their fellow soldiers, I was going to walk beside them. We descended to the surface in a single shuttle, 6 of us in total, landing at coordinates Grace Whitfield's transmission had specified, an open stretch of land far from any settlement, ringed by low hills and a single stand of trees that our scans confirmed held no concealed structures, no weapons signatures, no life signs beyond a small group of humans already waiting for our arrival. I want to describe that first direct meeting with the level of care it deserves, because everything I believed about this species, everything our 2 centuries of study had taught us, began quietly unraveling in the span of those first few minutes on the ground. Grace Whitfield was, by human standards, an older woman, her hair the pale gray I had come to associate with advanced age in their species, her posture upright and unhurried in a way that struck me immediately as inconsistent with someone representing a defeated, frightened population. She was accompanied by 4 others, among them a younger man she introduced as Nathan Pierce, and a woman with sharp, watchful eyes named Sophie Marsh, both of whom stood slightly apart from the group in postures I recognized, even across the considerable gap between our species, as distinctly protective rather than fearful. Grace Whitfield spoke through a translation device of her own, her voice calm and measured as she thanked us for agreeing to meet, and then, without any of the hesitation or careful diplomatic phrasing I had expected from a representative of a conquered people, she asked me a direct question that I have not been able to forget since. She asked whether our fleet had begun losing crew members yet. I did not answer immediately. I studied her face for any sign of the satisfaction or hidden cruelty I might have expected from an enemy confirming the success of some hidden attack, and I found none. What I found instead, and what unsettled me far more than open hostility would have, was something that looked very much like genuine concern. I told her, carefully, that our fleet had experienced certain unexplained irregularities, choosing my words with the caution of someone unwilling to reveal the full extent of our losses to a population we still, at that point, considered a potential threat. Grace Whitfield nodded slowly at my careful answer, as though she had expected exactly this kind of guarded response, and then she said something that changed the entire shape of what I believed we were facing. She told us that what was happening to our crews was not something her government had planned, and was not, strictly speaking, something any human authority controlled at all. She said that centuries ago, long before her people had built the cities and governments we had studied from orbit, there had been an agreement made, an old and largely forgotten arrangement between certain human communities and something that had existed on their world long before humanity itself had risen to any position of dominance over it. She used a phrase that matched almost exactly the fragment our translation team had recovered from the recorded footage days earlier, the Deep Watchers, and she explained, with the plain, unadorned tone of someone reciting a fact rather than a legend, that these Watchers had agreed, in exchange for certain considerations her people still honored to this day, to defend humanity against any outside force that arrived intending to conquer or destroy them. I asked her, and I remember my voice sounding steadier than I felt in that moment, what exactly these Watchers were. Grace Whitfield's answer was honest in a way that offered no comfort at all. She said she did not fully know. She said no living human fully knew, that the knowledge passed down through the old agreements was fragmentary at best, maintained more as ritual and duty than as complete understanding, tended by small communities scattered across their world who considered themselves caretakers of a debt rather than masters of a weapon. She said her government's role, and the role of the evacuation convoys we had watched leave their cities in the days before, was not military in any sense our fleet would recognize. It was ceremonial. Ships carrying representatives from those old caretaker communities toward gathering points where a very different kind of response could be properly, deliberately invited. Sophie Marsh spoke for the first time then, her voice sharper than Grace Whitfield's, carrying an edge that I read, correctly, as barely restrained anger. She told us that her own brother had served aboard one of the small patrol vessels that had monitored the evacuation routes in the earliest days of our arrival, before the invasion had truly begun, a human patrol vessel destroyed in the first hours of our fleet's assault on their orbital defenses. She said she did not feel obligated to apologize to us for anything her people's oldest allies chose to do in response to what our fleet had already done to her world before we ever extended a single request for cooperation. I had no answer for her. I still do not have one. Recording this account now, days later, with a fleet reduced to 17 ships and a crew roster that grows shorter with every cycle. Nathan Pierce, who had remained silent through most of the exchange, finally spoke, and his words carried none of Sophie Marsh's open hostility, only a kind of weary, practical honesty that I found, in its own way, more unsettling than anger would have been. He told us that the Watchers did not distinguish between combatants and non-combatants in the way our fleet's doctrine assumed all rational forces must. He said the old agreement did not ask them to. It asked only that they defend the world and its people from those who came intending to take it by force, and that the Watchers, whatever they actually were, appeared to interpret that mandate broadly, methodically, and without any interest whatsoever in negotiation once the process had been formally invited to begin. I asked Grace Whitfield, directly, whether there was any way to stop what had already been set into motion, whether an offer of full withdrawal, an immediate and complete cessation of our fleet's occupation efforts, might convince these Watchers to release whatever hold they had already taken over our missing crews and allow the remainder of our fleet to depart in peace. Her answer took a long time to come, and when it did, it was delivered with something that looked, unmistakably, like genuine regret, an emotion I had not expected to see directed toward us by anyone standing on that field. She said that the invitation, once formally extended by a threatened population, could not simply be recalled. She said the old agreements her communities maintained were built on a kind of trust that flowed in only one direction once triggered, and that asking the Watchers to stop partway through a response they had already begun would be, in her words, like asking a fire to reconsider halfway through a house, after it had already been lit with full knowledge and full permission. She did, however, offer us one piece of information that I have turned over in my mind every hour since, weighing whether it was offered out of genuine mercy or simply as one more layer of the trap we had already fallen into. She told us that the Watchers, whatever their true nature, operated according to a kind of proportion, that the response we were experiencing was not without limit and would not continue indefinitely against a force that demonstrated, clearly and immediately, both the intention and the action of complete withdrawal. She said that a fleet actively retreating, actively abandoning its occupation, stood a meaningfully better chance of surviving the encounter than a fleet that remained in their system, attempting to salvage any part of the conquest it had originally come to complete. I asked her how she could be certain of this. She told me, with a directness I found strangely more trustworthy than reassurance would have been, that she was not certain of anything where the Watchers were concerned. She said her people had lived alongside this old, half-understood arrangement for longer than written history recorded, and had learned, across countless generations, to respect its patterns without ever fully claiming to understand its reasoning. We returned to our shuttle in silence, all 6 of us, and the flight back to the fleet felt longer than the descent had, each of us alone with whatever conclusions this meeting had forced us to confront. I remember looking out at the darkening curve of their world as we ascended, at the scattered lights of cities our fleet had already, in some technical sense, conquered, and feeling for the first time since accepting command of this campaign that I understood almost nothing about the true nature of what we were fighting. I convened the full command staff the moment we returned to the flagship, and I relayed everything Grace Whitfield and her companions had told us, watching the faces around that table shift from disbelief to something closer to dread as the implications settled over each officer in turn. Drennick Osha, our physician, was the first to speak once I finished, and his question was as clinical and precise as ever, though the weight behind it had changed entirely. He asked what evidence we had that any of what we had just been told was even true, rather than an elaborate piece of psychological warfare designed to convince a superior force to retreat without a fight. It was a fair question, and one I did not have a complete answer for, but Issa, who had remained quiet through most of the briefing, offered the observation that finally tipped the room toward consensus. She pointed out that everything Grace Whitfield had described matched, point for point, the pattern of losses we had already documented ourselves, independently, before we ever heard a single word from any human representative. The proximity to evacuation convoys, the complete absence of forced entry or struggle, the strange, unsettling calm captured in the recorded footage from the 3rd convoy days earlier. None of that evidence had come from Grace Whitfield. It had come from our own instruments, our own recovery teams, our own careful documentation, and it all pointed toward the exact same conclusion. She had simply given us the language to finally understand. Thulren was the one who finally asked the question that mattered most. He asked what I intended to do with this information. I did not answer him immediately, because the answer, once I allowed myself to fully consider it, meant admitting something no fleet commander in the history of our people had ever been asked to admit in the middle of an active campaign. It meant admitting that the conquest was already lost, not through any failure of our weapons or our strategy in the traditional sense, but through a force our doctrine had never been built to anticipate, and that the only rational path remaining to us was the one that offered any measurable chance of bringing the surviving members of this fleet home alive. I gave the order to begin a full withdrawal less than an hour after that briefing concluded, knowing even as I gave it that we had already lost far more than the 95 crew members our official reports accounted for, and knowing, with a certainty that settled into me like a physical weight, that the coming hours would test whether Grace Whitfield's warning about proportion and mercy held any truth at all, or whether it had simply been the final, gentle push needed to send an already doomed fleet running directly into whatever waited for us next. The withdrawal order went out to every remaining vessel in our fleet within minutes, and I want to be clear about what that order actually meant in practical terms, because the phrase itself sounds simpler than the reality of executing it. 407 ships remained under my command at that point, spread across a formation that had spent the better part of a week establishing careful orbital positions, supply lines, and monitoring posts across an entire planetary system. Reversing that entire arrangement, coordinating the retreat of a fleet that size while maintaining any kind of defensive cohesion, was not something that could happen instantly, no matter how urgently I wanted it to. I ordered our outermost vessels to begin their departure first, reasoning that ships furthest from the planet itself faced the least immediate exposure and could establish a protective corridor for the rest of the fleet to withdraw through. Thulren coordinated the technical details of the maneuver with his usual precision, though I noticed, watching him work through those first critical hours, a tightness in his manner that had not been there even during our worst moments earlier in the campaign. He did not need to say what he was thinking. I was thinking it too. We were racing against something we could not see, could not track, and had no way of measuring the true speed of, and every minute our withdrawal took to complete was another minute for whatever force Grace Whitfield had described to close whatever distance still remained between it and the rest of our crews. The first 2 hours of the withdrawal proceeded without incident, and I allowed myself the smallest measure of cautious relief as our outer formation vessels began reporting successful departures from the system's outer edge, engines burning hard toward the safety of open space beyond any boundary the watchers might recognize as belonging to their world. I remember standing on the command deck watching those departure confirmations accumulate on the tactical display, each one a small, hard-won victory, and thinking, foolishly, that perhaps we had moved quickly enough, that perhaps Grace Whitfield's warning about proportion truly meant we would be given the chance to leave with our numbers largely intact. I was wrong, and the correction came swiftly and without warning. 3 hours into the withdrawal, we lost contact with an entire cluster of 11 ships simultaneously, vessels that had been holding a defensive line near the edge of the planet's largest moon, providing cover for the slower supply and logistics ships still completing their own departure preparations. 11 ships, not one at a time, not spaced across hours the way our previous losses had been, but all 11 falling silent within the same narrow window of only a few minutes, their transponder signals simply ceasing, one after another, in a pattern that our tracking systems logged with a kind of mechanical, uncaring precision that felt almost cruel to witness. I ordered an immediate halt to any further movement by nearby vessels, unwilling to send additional ships blindly into whatever had just claimed 11 of our own, and instead authorized a single long-range scan of the affected area, keeping our sensor platform at the maximum safe distance our instruments allowed. What that scan revealed, displayed on the tactical table in front of the entire remaining command staff, was unlike anything any of us had encountered in the previous days of mounting horror. The 11 ships were still there, still intact, according to every hull integrity reading our scanners could gather. But surrounding them, faint and shifting at the very edge of our sensor resolution, was something our systems struggled to categorize at all, a pattern of energy or mass, we genuinely could not determine which, that our automated analysis software simply labeled as unknown, unable to fit the reading into any category our fleet's instruments had ever been designed to recognize. It did not register as a weapon. It did not register as a ship. It did not register in any conventional sense as a coherent object at all, and yet it surrounded those 11 vessels in a shape that our tactical officers, studying the readout in tense, unbroken silence, eventually and reluctantly agreed, resembled something almost deliberate, almost patient, the way a predator might surround prey it had already decided did not need to be rushed. Issa was the one who finally broke the silence in that room, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it during our years of service together. She said that whatever we were looking at was not attacking those 11 ships. It was simply waiting, with the same unhurried, methodical patience that had characterized every single loss our fleet had suffered since the very first patrol craft went silent days earlier. I made the decision, against every instinct in my body urging me to attempt some kind of rescue, to continue the withdrawal of every other vessel in the fleet, rather than risk additional ships attempting to reach the 11 we had already, in every practical sense, already lost. It remains, to this day, one of the most difficult orders I have ever given, and I will carry the weight of it for whatever remains of my career, however long that career now turns out to be. But Grace Whitfield's warning echoed in my mind as I gave that order, her description of proportion, of a response calibrated to the actions of the force it defended against, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost like grief, that the only thing I could still control was whether the retreating fleet demonstrated, clearly and completely, that it intended to leave. The withdrawal continued through the following 6 hours in a state that I can only describe as controlled dread, every officer on every remaining vessel working with the tight, focused urgency of people who understood that speed itself might be the only defense available to them. We lost 4 more ships during those 6 hours, each disappearing in the same manner as before, silent, sudden, without any warning our sensors could detect in advance, and each loss landing on the command deck with a particular, sickening weight that never lessened no matter how many times we absorbed it. It was during the final stretch of the withdrawal, as the core of our remaining fleet approached the outer boundary of the system, that Drennick Osha brought forward an observation that shifted my understanding of what we were experiencing one final time. He had been tracking, quietly and independently, the exact locations of every ship we lost throughout the entire campaign, cross-referencing those locations against the fleet's actual withdrawal trajectory, and what he found offered a strange, cold kind of clarity. Every ship lost during the withdrawal phase had been lost while still positioned behind the main body of the retreating fleet, either providing rearguard cover, completing delayed departure preparations, or in the case of the 11 ships near the moon, holding a defensive line intended to protect other vessels rather than moving toward the boundary themselves. Not a single ship that had been actively, continuously moving toward the system's outer edge, with no defensive or covering responsibilities slowing its departure, had been lost during the entire withdrawal. I want to be careful about what conclusion I draw from that observation, because I do not fully understand the reasoning behind it, even now, and I am wary of assuming I understand the logic of something I still cannot see, still cannot measure, and still cannot meaningfully communicate with. But the pattern held, consistently, across every single loss we suffered during those 6 critical hours, and it matched, with an unsettling precision, exactly what Grace Whitfield had told us on that quiet field days earlier. A fleet actively fleeing, fully and visibly committed to leaving, appeared to be treated differently than a fleet that remained, in any capacity, still positioned within the system performing any function beyond its own departure. I gave the order, immediately upon hearing Osha's findings, to abandon every remaining defensive or covering position across the fleet, instructing every single ship, without exception, to prioritize direct movement toward the system's outer boundary above all other considerations, including the protection of slower vessels still completing their own departures. It was a brutal order in its implications, one that effectively told our own crews to look only to their own survival rather than each other's. And I gave it anyway, because by that point in the withdrawal I no longer trusted any strategy built on the assumption that our fleet could protect itself through unity, cohesion, or mutual defense. Those assumptions had already cost us more than 100 lives across a pattern I finally, fully understood. The final hours of the withdrawal passed in a blur of urgent, individual departures, each ship racing for the boundary on its own trajectory, no longer holding formation, no longer providing cover for anyone but itself. I remained on the command deck of the flagship throughout, watching the tactical display narrow, ship by ship, as vessels either successfully crossed the boundary and vanished from our tracking range into the safety of open space, or, in a handful of remaining cases, simply went silent, their transponder signals ending exactly as every previous loss had ended, without warning, without struggle, without any final transmission that might have told us what those crews experienced in their last moments. By the time our flagship itself crossed the boundary, engines burning at a rate that strained systems never designed for this kind of sustained emergency output, the tactical display in front of me showed a number I still find difficult to fully accept, even now, recording this account from what I hope is finally a position of relative safety. 17 ships, out of 412 that had departed our home shipyards with total, unquestioned confidence in a swift and certain conquest, 17 remained, carrying between them a fraction of the crew complement we had brought into that system less than 2 weeks earlier. I ordered every remaining vessel to continue burning outward, well past the point our navigation officers considered strictly necessary for safety, unwilling to trust any margin smaller than the widest one our remaining fuel reserves could support. It was only after 6 additional hours of continuous, uninterrupted flight, well beyond any boundary Grace Whitfield's account had described as belonging to the Watcher's domain, that I finally allowed the fleet to reduce speed, and it was only then, in that first quiet moment since the withdrawal began, that the full weight of what we had lost finally settled over the command deck in a silence heavier than any alarm had ever been. I am recording the remainder of this account 4 days after that final withdrawal, from a position well outside the boundaries of the human system, with our 17 surviving ships holding formation around the flagship, while repair crews work through what remains of our combined resources trying to stabilize systems strained far beyond their intended limits. I have spent much of those 4 days reviewing every record our fleet gathered throughout the entire campaign, searching for anything that might help our people understand what we encountered, and searching, if I am honest, for some way to explain the decisions I made that I could present to a council that will almost certainly demand a full accounting of how a fleet this size returned in this condition. The final tally, once every roster was cross-referenced and every missing crew member confirmed against the last recorded location of their vessel, stands at just over 11,000 personnel unaccounted for, out of a fleet that departed our home shipyards carrying nearly 19,000 souls in total. I do not know how to fully communicate what a number like that means, even to myself, even having lived through every day of the campaign that produced it. I know the figures, I know the reports. I still find myself, in quiet moments between duty shifts, unable to fully accept that so many people who served under my command are simply gone, without graves, without remains, without any final confirmation of what happened to them beyond the calm, cold data our instruments recorded in the seconds before their transponders went silent. Thulrin has remained close to me through these 4 days, functioning now as my senior surviving officer in a fleet that lost the majority of its command structure along with everything else. He asked me, during one of our few quiet moments together, whether I believed we could have avoided this outcome entirely, whether some different decision earlier in the campaign, made with the knowledge we eventually gained too late, might have spared us the losses we ultimately suffered. I have turned that question over many times since he asked it, and I do not have a satisfying answer for him, or for myself. I believe, based on everything Grace Whitfield told us and everything our own instruments independently confirmed, that the moment our fleet chose Conquest over any other approach to that system, the outcome we experienced became, in some fundamental sense, already decided. Whatever the Watchers truly are, they did not respond to our fleet's tactics, our fleet's strength, or our fleet's discipline. They responded to a single, simple fact that no amount of superior firepower could have changed. We arrived intending to take something from a people who were not, in fact, undefended in the way 2 centuries of observation had led us to believe. Issa has spent much of these 4 days attempting to compile a full account of the human civilization we encountered, working from every scrap of data our fleet gathered during the campaign, and she shared with me, on the 3rd day, a conclusion that I believe deserves to be recorded here alongside everything else. She said that our 2 centuries of study had focused almost entirely on the aspects of human civilization our doctrine was equipped to measure and understand: their governments, their weapons, their divisions, their conflicts, and had almost entirely overlooked the older, quieter threads running beneath all of it, the traditions, the old arrangements the caretaker communities Grace Whitfield had described on that field days ago, maintained not for strategic advantage but simply because they had always been maintained, passed down with a patience and continuity our own more openly aggressive culture had never developed a framework for recognizing as a form of strength at all. I do not know whether the Council will accept this explanation when I present my full report. I suspect many among them will search for a simpler answer: a hidden weapon our intelligence division failed to detect, a technological advantage we underestimated, something that fits more comfortably within the categories our doctrine already understands. I intend to give them the true account regardless, exactly as I have recorded it here, because I believe a comfortable lie about what happened to this fleet would only guarantee that the same catastrophe repeats itself against the next commander who looks at this world and sees only the weakness our old reports described, without ever looking deeper at what that weakness had always, quietly, been protecting. Drennick Osha raised one final point during our review sessions that I think about more than any other, sitting now in the relative quiet of a command deck built for a crew 4 times larger than the one currently serving aboard it. He asked whether the Watchers had truly acted with the mercy Grace Whitfield described, allowing our retreating vessels to escape once we demonstrated genuine, complete withdrawal, or whether what we actually experienced was simply the natural limit of whatever process governed their response, a boundary we happened to reach, rather than a mercy we were specifically granted. I do not know the answer to that question, and I suspect I never will, not from any position our fleet could realistically occupy again. But I find, turning the question over these past 4 days, that I no longer particularly care which explanation is correct. 17 ships returned. Whether that number reflects mercy or simply the outer edge of an old, patient system operating exactly as it was always designed to operate, the practical outcome for the crews still serving under my command remains the same, and I intend to spend whatever authority I still hold ensuring that no fleet from our people ever tests that boundary again. I have drafted, over these 4 days, a formal recommendation that will accompany my full report to the Council, urging that our people abandon any further consideration of conquest directed at this particular world, not out of fear alone, though I will not pretend fear plays no part in this recommendation, but out of a conclusion I have reached after everything our fleet witnessed and everything Grace Whitfield chose, for reasons I still do not fully understand, to share with us on that quiet field before the worst of our losses began. Some worlds carry defenses that cannot be measured through the instruments and doctrine our people have always relied upon, defenses built across centuries of quiet continuity rather than open displays of strength, and a species wise enough to recognize the difference between weakness and patience will survive considerably longer than one that continues mistaking the two. Thulren asked me, during our final conversation before I began recording this account in full, what I plan to tell the families of the 11,000 crew members who will not be returning home alongside the rest of us. I told him the same thing I am recording here, for whatever official or unofficial audience eventually reviews this account. I will tell them the truth, exactly as we lived it, because it is the only thing I have left to offer them, and because somewhere beyond the boundary of a system I hope none of our people ever approach again, there is a world that believed itself conquered for exactly 6 days, and that proved, with a patience and quiet certainty I do not fully understand even now, that it had never actually needed our mercy at all. We were the ones who needed theirs, and for reasons that remain, and will likely always remain, beyond my full understanding, 17 ships and the crews still serving aboard them were the ones who received it. This is Fleet Speaker Vren Ashketal, formally closing this account for transmission to Council review. 412 ships departed with certainty, 17 returned with none at all, and I have come to believe that the second condition, difficult as it has been to carry these past 4 days, is very likely the only honest one a commander of any conquest fleet should ever be allowed to hold.